Good evening. Thank you for your patience as we get started. Well, welcome everyone to the Center for Architecture. My name is Fu Yuo, and I co-chair the Planning and Urban Design Committee here at the AIA New York. Tonight we have a special occasion that works in collaboration with the Municipal Art Society and the Graduate School of Architecture and Planning and Preservation of Columbia University. And within that, the Urban Design Program. So I want to extend the welcome with our allied organizations and begin this program. And to start us off, you know, I had been thinking about some recent terminology that has come into commonplace. This is the idea of a heat island, heat dome, atmospheric rivers, for example, and all of these are quite interesting terminologies. And I think tonight we want to add one more to that kind of vocabulary called the climate corridor. And what's interesting in this event is it's focused on something we all know very well, the urban arterial as a subject, which both supports and disrupts neighborhood and city living. So it's with this opportunity that this conversation can come together, built on previous work from MAS, and in conjunction with my colleague here, who has done some creative research, which includes pedagogy, and I'll introduce in just a second. But the conversation that we are hosting is about the seemingly narrow, yet substantial space of the movement of goods, people, and services, which overlaps with places to restore urban health for local residents, flora, fauna, and which includes the right-of-way for critical infrastructure of public utilities and stormwater systems. So let's imagine that, a climate corridor as a community asset. A new term we need as not to subject to more negative climate effect, but rather as to purposefully transform a solution in responsible urbanization. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Kaya Kuhl, whom has been collaboratively developing urban design languages responsive to a climate and community agenda. Kaya is an urban designer and principal of You Are the City, a WPE certified research and design practice based in Brooklyn, New York. Kaya also teaches at Columbia University and the City College of New York. Please welcome Kaya to lead our conversation today.
I'm going to start off with admitting what has been. This has been sort of a dream of mine. That at the end of a semester, my students who are in the room tonight are not standing up front, and a panel of jurors tells them all the things that they could have done differently, which they won't because it's the end of the semester, but that instead, I think the most learning comes from listening to people having a conversation about sort of the shared questions that we all ask ourselves throughout the semester. And so I'm really glad that we're having this conversation now, and not just between the four of us, and I'm going to introduce the panelists in a minute, but also hopefully between all of us about this space between buildings on urban arterials. So with me up front here are tonight Tiffany Ann Taylor. She's the Vice President for Transportation at the Regional Plan Association. Prior to RPA, she served as Deputy Director of Freight Programs, Education and Research for the Freight Mobility Unit at the New York City Department of Transportation. And as an Assistant Vice President at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. So In the context of urban arterials, I'm really happy to have a freight expert here because many of these big roads that we see in the background here are also truck routes. Right next to me is Zach Youngerman. He's a third-generation New Yorker, so he's had a lot more experience with urban arterials than me, probably, as a lifelong New Yorker. And he's a city planner with nearly 15 years of experience in urban environmental stewardship, climate resilience, and public outreach. And as the director of resiliency at NYC DOT, Zach oversees a team managing the design and implementation of resiliency projects and the development of resiliency policies for the agency. And then we're also joined by Stephen Albanese. He's a senior project manager for planning and urban design at the Municipal Art Society, where he leads the organization's research on improving the design and management of New York City's public realm, and initiated a project at MAS, Greener Corridors for a more resilient city. And this has really been sort of the beginning of my starting to think this is worthy of a seminar and digging into deeper to collaborate on what can we do about this typology. So Fu already did an amazing job at introducing why urban arterials. I just want to add that I have a personal experience with this. I cross one of them almost every day with a child. And that reminds me of the constant dangers. Discomfort is what in our seminar we talked about a lot that we all experience when engaging with these arterials. But there are also spaces of opportunity. They're 25% of all of our streets, and we all know that streets they are the biggest public property that we have in our cities. It's the space that we all share. Somewhat unconditionally, we all have the same right to that space, however the means in which vehicle we travel may condition that a little bit. And as Stephen in his first post and his research pointed out, they are, it's an enormous space. They're more than the space of more than 10 central parks. So how can we rethink of how to use that space better as a shared space? I invited my students to help me moderate this conversation tonight. So throughout the evening, I will ask groups of students to share their thoughts, and you see the slides of their designs looping through here. We went and walked 4 of these arterials over the past 3 months. That's probably not something that many people do, to walk along these for an hour or so. They're loud, they're dangerous, you're exposed to pretty bad air quality. But that also helped us with our data analysis and coming up with some solutions. So students will phrase these ideas in the form of questions to our panelists. But before we start talking about these ideas, I wanted to ask each of you to maybe start with a brief introduction of your own involvement or relationship to arterials. And it can be personal, it can be your organization's involvement, maybe a short 2-sentence statement to start off the conversation. Do you want to start with me?
Sure. So hi everyone, good evening. Oh yeah, I love when people respond, thank you. So I will say 2 really quick things. So one, RPA just generally cares about this stuff. We have a bunch of reports. One of our more recent reports was literally called Re-envisioning the right-of-way, in which we actually talk about this, right? We have this huge public asset, and what happens if we were to reallocate it for different things so that there's different uses. So that's why I'm here. But interestingly enough, one of the images on Jerome Avenue really resonated with me because when I was in planning school, when I first got there, I didn't know really what my area of expertise would be. And our first, for my class, my first mini studio was Westchester Avenue in the Bronx, which looks just like Jerome Avenue. And it was me taking the elevated train at, the 6 train on the elevated line, going down below onto the commercial street and seeing the pillars divide the street, seeing people having difficulty crossing, seeing people have difficulty getting the bus, getting a taxi. That's the thing that actually made me realize I wanted to focus on transportation. So I would say those are my relationships to the topic.
So hello everybody. Thanks Kaya and EIU for having us. I too sometimes cross arterials with a child. I live in Astoria and you can hear a loud noise right now. I frequently go near Northern Boulevard and Astoria Boulevard. As Kaya mentioned, for the past year I've been working on an initiative called Greener Corridors for a More Resilient City. And I want to give a shout out to my colleague Rana, who's been working very closely with me on it. Essentially, it's sort of attempting to ask the question that we're, I think, all trying to answer tonight, which is how can these spaces be models of public health, sustainability, multi-mobility, and equity among the communities along their paths, and how can that happen without displacing the very people who would most benefit from these improvements. And so we've been speaking with community members and experts across various disciplines over the past year. Also been publishing, as Kaya mentioned, a series of really in-depth research articles that take a really critical look at these corridors, inventory efforts the city is doing to improve them, and then feature case studies from around the country and around the world that can be role models for New York City. But we also do include a number of New York City examples because we do have a lot of great things that are happening here by our own agencies and advocates. So it's a little bit about the project.
Thank you. I'd say what brings me here tonight and my connection to Arterials is a study that we did internally at DOT, funded by FEMA's BRIC program called Cool Corridors. And it's a capacity and capability technical expertise building study for us, so it's not, unfortunately I don't have any big announcements about it, but the idea was to research, first identify and research interventions globally and even from in New York, but maybe not yet on the right-of-way, that we could consider for both reducing temperature on, ambient temperature on streets and providing relief. So both the kind of large personalist change to the environment and very direct changes to people's comfort and body temperature. So I'll tease out some of the lessons from that over the course of the evening, I think.
Thanks, thank you. And I want to start it off with, and maybe start with the team that looked at Jamaica Avenue first, with kicking us off with your first impressions and questions.
Shall we stand or we sleep?
However you want.
So basically we're working on Jamaica Avenue, trying to imagine like what this corridor could be. And a month ago we went site visit, so we kind of collect all the sticky notes about how people feel along the street, both negative and positive. So we kind of conclude this section of Jamaica Avenue that kind of received the most complaint from people. And I feel like the most interesting thing about it is like the sidewalk in Jamaica Avenue is actually wide enough for people passing through. So it's not about proportion, it's about something which is more invisible and more intangible. So we're looking for the data which is connected to the traffic accident and the urban heat and also the air pollution over there. In the sense that we find out Jamaica Avenue is not just like a main traffic corridor in the city, but it's also like a main corridor, a critical corridor that influences public health. So that's a whole plan what we envision Jamaica Avenue could be. Fantastic.
Yeah, so coming into the design, we try to put try to turn Jamaica Avenue into an anchor spine which would connect the whole area. Because it's a new, it has a new rezoning proposal coming in, right? They try to densify it, so we try to respond it by turning the Jamaica Avenue itself into a anchor spine that could connect the whole area as a one integrated walkable community. And to do that, we put some micromobility facilities with bike lanes, bike racks, dedicated bus stops, and we try to elevate the pedestrian way, eliminating side parking and narrowing the car lanes. And lastly, we put greeneries on and tree canopies to control the local microclimate of the corridor itself.
So from the idea that we came up, we draw out this section and how people can navigate and breathe safely. So we're trying to reorganize this section of Jamaica Avenue to we try to reducing the automobile spaces, highlight the people significant, allocating more room for people to breathe under green canopies, also on the surface on the soft surface of cityscape. So considering from our idea that these spaces could be re-envisioned to provide safe and comfortable conditions for people mobility first. So we came up with a question after this drawing that what kind of policies or coordination structure that should be implemented to prioritize to moving people before efficiencies. For that, we think that because the streets are the shared space that we own together.
Thank you. And I was wondering, I think this is maybe a good entrance into Zaki talking a little bit more about cool corridors, because it's really the impact on human health that the statistics that the students showed, appears here that we seem to have forgotten a little bit and prioritize efficiency of movement over the health, and the cool corridor project seems to bring that back a little bit.
Yeah, and there was a component of it that looked at the kind of cost-benefit analysis, or the degree to which we could quantify human health. And unfortunately, the statistics around heat and mortality and morbidity, so death and hospital visits, didn't really allow us to make the case. It was a bit too tenuous in terms of what the data was to say if we reduced ambient temperature on the streets, these many fewer people would be admitted to an emergency room or something. But certainly at a conceptual level, the idea that people have to travel, and it's part of DOT's mission to make sure that people are traveling both safely and sustainably, makes a lot of sense. So if people are avoiding trips because it's too hot outside, if people are taking trips at night instead of during the day because it's too hot out, that's also a really interesting factor from a design perspective. And also in terms of the modal switch. So if people step outside and say, gosh, it's just too hot, like I'm gonna order an Uber, or like there's no way I'm gonna wait at a bus stop, so forget it, I'm not gonna take this trip right now. Our system is not functioning as well, and there's also that sustainability component where if streets aren't comfortable, then people are switching perhaps to a less sustainable and perhaps less healthy mode to get where they're going. So the idea of tying public health to the built environment along corridors of travel, I think is really important. And again, from our perspective, there are places in the city, parks, plazas to some degree, and cooling centers that are meant as places of refuge during heat. But for people who still need to travel by foot, making sure that those trips are safe and comfortable really is important.
Have you seen this in case study research, Stephen, that cooling and or human comfort in the street space is prioritized over speed or efficiency?
Yeah, I think so.
What
I
does
mean,
it look
yeah,
like?
yeah. Well, I think, you know, we have examples here in New York City. You know, some of our historic parkways, Eastern Parkway, Ocean Parkway. These were designed, you know, to essentially, the park is in the name. They were designed to be sort of extensions of parks, and you go there, and you know, they indeed, you know, are measurably cooler than some of these spaces. You know, in Jamaica, for example, which, you know, is one of the hottest areas of New York City, and that's in a city that already has, according to a recent study by, I think it was Climate Central maybe, has the greatest urban heat island effect of any city in the country. And so, you know, this is a really hot part of New York City. So, you know, those are a couple of examples in New York City. I think there are other cities around the world that we can look to as well. I was fortunate to go to Barcelona over the summer, and they have some really incredible streets that they are they're overhauling as part of literally a green urban corridors program. And so they're building in this huge expansive tree canopy into a lot of these spaces, but even down to the sidewalk level, you know, there's a lot of permeable pavement and you know, vegetation within sidewalk spaces themselves. So it's sort of all aspects of the experience there. A couple of other examples, you know, from Colombia, Medellin, Colombia. They have sort of a famous greener corridors program where they have taken a very intentional approach to a lot of their spaces like these that we have in New York City, and they have built out a vegetation canopy along a lot of medians there, sort of along the lines of what DOT is doing with its Great Streets program here, but on a bigger scale. And that has been sort of replicated in other cities, like Monterrey in Mexico is doing something similar. So, you know, there are real models for this. And I should say that Medellin, Colombia, actually, after they began sort of implementing this program, I'm sure it's hard to say what exactly caused this, but in the years after, the temperature of the city did decrease by 2 degrees Celsius. So undoubtedly that played a role, and you know, that's a pretty significant difference in temperature, you know, in an urban environment.
And I'm curious. I was curious about what you said, that you weren't able to create a correlation between the health impact of urban heat and, or to make a case. And so prior to today, we had a conversation where I mentioned also in our class, we researched other environmental issues in streets, and air quality kills by far more people in New York, and it's probably over 2,000 a year versus about 350 that die of heat. And that's probably even harder to sort of measure and make the case that this is connected to traffic arterials. And I'm wondering, and this is a question for any of you, like what are the policies that, or processes that are missing where we can bring this you know, public health analysis into the conversation in that way, that we're not only talking about traffic fatalities, which are also awful in these arterials, but that we can bring other health aspects into the planning of these spaces.
I have some thoughts, but first I'm going to crack the door.
I didn't want to interrupt you while you were talking.
So let's
We
bear
can
with.
change the design and management of our built space to address heat.
Okay, so we'll do our best with that. And there's also a chair up here if anybody who's standing wants to take it, please. You're not interrupting us.
One over here also.
And there's an extra one over here. Okay. I love a hospitable environment for everyone, so that's why. Yeah, please. There's 2 chairs up front. Please take one. Okay, now that we're all relaxed. Yeah, I think quite interestingly, to be quite honest with you, I think it actually starts in education about what we're talking about. And this is really for me, given that there are students here. You know, and for me in graduate school, as a planner, there weren't like, I would say there wasn't intentionality in connecting the work that I was doing to public health at the time. And I know I can't be, I see some folks nodding their heads, so I know that's something that other people have experienced. I think now, post, or maybe even during pandemic, that sounds like a strange statement to make, especially for those of you who might have been in graduate school during the pandemic. But that was really true. Even the idea of sustainability, like that was my buzzword in graduate school, and all the explanations of what sustainability could mean. So I would actually say, can we actually start in the canon of literature that we're teaching to actually make that direct connection? I think as part of that education, for me, one of the things that I like to tell students when I speak to them especially is, if you're focused on transportation, you also need to understand that what you are doing has generational impact. Like, it's not actually just about moving a bus stop. It's not actually just about widening a sidewalk. You literally heard Zach say, we are looking at the correlation between like the materials that we're using, how hot something is, a correlation between hospital admissions, right? And so you need to understand that your work actually has generational impact, and have that be reinforced in your education. I think also, to your point, Kaya, even now, the idea of public health expanding to something like road safety is kind of newer. When I was at DOT, I worked on the Vision Zero task force for the city, and my purview was freight. And as part of that task force, we actually had a member from Department of Health and Mental Hygiene on it. And that was unusual to me, because I don't typically work with them in the work that I do. I do more so now. And so again, you know, being persistent, reiterating, reinforcing in the professional space that these conversations actually need to happen at the same time is really helpful. And then I think there needs to be more of a conversation around, like, as consumers and residents, what types of choices and trade-offs are we willing to have, right? So just to pick on freight for an example, the pandemic has really changed much of our ordering habits, right? Like, a lot of things come to us directly to the door that maybe we would have walked outside to get, or consolidated trips to get. And yes, there's lots of other issues within the system. Not everything is, you know, tied to you buying something from Amazon. But it is worthwhile to think about, like, what is my one action doing as part of the chain reaction to get to here? So I guess the short answer is, I think a general education, very much from when you're learning the basics through on when you are a practitioner, about the connection, the direct connection between public health and this aspect of urban planning is probably what we need.
Anyone else?
Well, I guess I'll just add that, you know, I think it also, you know, really starts by understanding who lives near these spaces and who uses them. You know, their intention in the way that they are categorized and designed is to move to, not through. And in many cases, you know, I think, you know, a majority of people who live near there do use it that way. But in our research, you know, we found when you look at environmental justice communities, you know, in terms of the large, you know, non-highway arterials in those communities, most people are actually, who live near them, are not actually getting in a car to go to work. So they're not necessarily using it the way that it's designed within their community. You know, more people in those areas tend to take public transportation or walk or bike to work than the citywide average. And so, you know, there's sort of a disconnect between, you know, the predominant people who are moving through these spaces and the people near them who, you know, many of them are driving, but many of them are just bearing, you know, the sort of noise, the pollution and the heat costs of these projects. And so I think we have to take a really critical look at each one of these, but also them as a system together, and sort of reevaluate the priorities for them and who we're prioritizing them for.
One thing that became very obvious when we looked at these different arterials in 4 of our 5 boroughs is also that many are undergoing land use changes along them, and so changing from a predominantly car repair shop land use along these corridors to more and more mixed use and residential really changes who uses the street and for what purpose. And want to suggest that I want to ask the Jerome Avenue team maybe to show their some images of their analysis of Jerome Avenue and ideas for it, because it gets a little bit to the heart of these changes.
So we started examining the street. So we took, it is a very long stretch in Bronx. So we took the part from Yankee Stadium till Fordham Road. And as Kaya said, that it was majorly the business occupation or the function on that avenue is related to automobile workshops, paint shops, cleaning shops and everything. So we tried and found this one stretch which was a little unique because it had a school, a university hall and auto repair shop all in one section, which is like placed like just juxtaposed against each other oddly, because like the street is it has an elevated rail and the noise is so much. The road width is around 70 feet with the elevated, so the elevated rail is in 30 feet and the extension is another 20 feet on each side, but all of that is used for vehicular movement. There is a big pathway, pedestrian walkway, but it is blank, and like because there is this elevated rail, only a few plants and trees are there because of the sunlight problem. So that was one of the issue in this stretch which we saw, and my colleague will say about what we thought and how we designed it.
Considering the street, there was like what Dutt mentioned, we had a lot of schools and universities, but also there are like a lot of thriving local businesses, which is mostly like these car repair shops. So, and along with the elevated subway, I think it added a very interesting character to the entire street. And I think we had to kind of pay attention to both like the pedestrians and making the streets more safer for like pedestrians. And we focused on like having elevated crosswalks, having safer intersections, but also it's for kids, it's for children, so making it more like safer for children, and also letting like these local businesses kind of spill out on the street, because they have like 2-3 lanes that are like just to keep their cars and stuff like. So we kind of let that be the way it is, but we added more car parkings with electric charging stations and having like program-based pavements for children. So I think it was a mix of both. And
yeah, and the questions which we came across our mind, there were 2 major questions. One was like what can be done recently, and one what can be done in the future. So the recently was that because like we said that the automobile shops have occupied like 2 lanes for just parking and washing the cars or doing the repair work. So is there a way in policy making that how the restaurants the city has given restaurants dedicated spaces to for their spill outs? Is there a way for informal businesses like this or other businesses to like the city can help them give them dedicated areas for their work or something like that, like with policy? And the other one is like future, because like this area has been like the zoning is getting converted into residential. So there will be houses next to the elevated rail, and the elevated rail is going to be there. So is there a way through landscape or like sort of like we have an abstract idea right now, like a very conceptual idea, that there is a sort of green grid cover alongside the railway which would act as a buffer. So is there some way through landscape or somehow which how we can reduce the noise caused by the trains, because this is like a similar situation in many neighborhoods of New York. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I want to paraphrase a little bit and let's start maybe with the first one, because I think what's interesting is that these are both somewhat prototypical conditions that, and the informal way in which car-related businesses spill out onto the street is really quite enormous in some areas, and it's not unique to Jerome Avenue, and really occupy the sidewalk and the parking lane and sometimes even one travel lane. That said, what we just did with dining sheds, can we think of a way to allow other businesses to occupy that zone at the curb in a way that it's safe for everyone else and useful for businesses? And who wants to pick that as a speculation of what we could do with the curb for businesses, current and future?
I'll go. That's actually a really interesting premise, to be honest with you. But there are a couple of things that I would think about that in tandem. One, which is just a general quote, I'm not seeing any freight movement, so we'll get to that. But even the sidewalk shed program had its challenges, right? Some of them were around accessibility. Right, so who is actually using the sidewalk itself, right? There is this space between where the sheds were and where the restaurant was. We heard lots of anecdotal evidence of folks with different mobility capacities not being able to use them, right? And the sidewalk, as we've all discussed, is a shared space. So I think that is a bit of a hiccup in the idea of that. But at the same time, creating a more formal structure for these businesses to still conduct their business, but also giving them more formal parameters about how much space in the street they can take up, I think we probably could benefit from. And I think, and I don't think that you're implying this, but I think that also it would probably only be certain categories of businesses that would be allowed to do that. But again, instituting a more strict regulation around that could actually be a benefit. And that's actually giving me something to think about. So I appreciate that idea.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer, but I think it does really depend on the business, whether it's an automotive repair business, an open restaurant, a pharmacy, a street vendor. I guess I will say that I do think that New York City is doing a lot of things at the moment. It's recently passed City of Yes for economic opportunity. Zoning text amendment does get at the automobile pedestrian conflicts that you're talking about. It remains to be seen how that plays out, but that was a very intentional part of it. DOT is also piloting you probably know this, micro hubs and smart curb management. So I think that people are thinking about it, but I really think that it's going to come down to the ability to scale these things. It's great to pilot them. We've got lots of brilliant ideas, but it's not going to make a noticeable difference unless they can be implemented at scale. And I think we're going to have to be far less, I guess, far more ambitious with how we repurpose curbside car parking spaces, which I think is what we're sort of getting at here. Something like only 80,000 of the 3 million parking spaces in New York City are metered. A lot of those are in the commercial corridor spaces that you're looking at. But that's a lot of parking that is just completely unregulated, and it's an incredible amount of space. And so I think that's one thing. We need to price parking according to demand in a way that makes more sense. But I also think we need a plan with a hierarchy of curb uses, deliveries, public transportation, micromobility, sanitation. All of those should be I think, given more priority among business uses too. And I think the city is certainly recognized that and is beginning to wade into that water a little more ambitiously. But we've got a long ways to go once these pilots are tested and we know the result to actually scale it up. So.
Yeah, that's a good jumping off point for me to talk, or at least mention the DOT's curb management plan, which has a lot of the elements that you're talking about in terms of kind of smart demand management, something more sophisticated and flexible than signage that says, commercial or loading zone, or, these are the hours by which certain uses take place, which is in the analog world, certainly a very, thoughtful, I'm sure at the time, way of thinking about different uses of the curb at different days of the week, times of the day, users and priorities among businesses versus, let's say, residents or shoppers. So there is work there. I'm really intrigued by this idea that I think everyone's pointed to around what other types of businesses could be supported by curbside access and who would pay for that. Like, we sort of understand that food and beverage services have taken advantage, sidewalk cafes. Okay, there are car washes and mechanics who clearly are using the curb. There's freight. There's the pilot of kind of delivery logistic zones at the curb. Would there be a demand for other types of entities to use the curb space, or is the model something more like a street seat, which is the kind of predecessor of the dining out shed, and it's a parklet that the bid supports for a little bit of placemaking, maybe a little bit of cooling, but this question of who else would be interested in paying for the curb as a business is really interesting. And then the other idea I want to just bring up, because we're in an educational space, is thinking about sensory urbanism, and the book that was really important to me a little while back was Sense of the City. It was actually an exhibit and book put on by the Canadian Centre for Architecture, Montreal's kind of equivalent. But we're thinking about questions of noise and other types of senses, solar orientation, things that get us beyond the kind of visual hegemony of planning and design, and thinking about natural cycles and day versus night, seasonality, even the kind of the generational idea, and landscape design is very good at that. But so that's my response to having no idea about dampening materials, but to say that I think it's a great entry point to thinking of other ways of thinking about the built environment beyond simply a plan versus section dichotomy.
And I would say it fits into our previous conversation about sort of the impact on human health, that we all know New York City is a very noisy city, and we sort of take it for granted, but we forget that if you work in that space, for instance, of an arterial, you work in a space that's above the decibel level that's recommended by public health officials. So adding those to our design thinking, our design vocabulary, is maybe something that we have overlooked in the past, because the elevated train is one thing, but even just a regular 3-lane road that we have many in our neighborhoods is also pretty noisy. I think we have more ideas about the curb zone, so maybe the Atlantic Avenue team can talk about their project.
Hi, we're so glad to share our thoughts about Atlantic Avenue. It's still like relate to what we talked before. It's lots of like manufacturing areas, automobile stores. So when we like going to the tour in the Atlantic Avenue, will be like kind of like separate because we are working from the more like a Brooklyn downtown area to the east. So it kind of like feel you're getting a different zone of like when you're walking by this whole corridors. And then we even saw like the avenue was have the situation was like a rezoning for the current decades. And then the people who living in the new buildings right there, they're gonna feel like more like you crossing the street, there was like a warehouse or storage buildings. So we thinking we designed the streets more like a benefit for everybody who in the streets, not only the manufactured buildings, but also the residents. So we create a more multi-functions zoning inside of like a always parking land in the street on both sides. So the place that we thinking can be more functionally is we create a spot for loading area for the stores. We create a spot for like getting interest of like the car stores, and then we create more green space maybe in front of like lots new buildings. So that can like solve the like a challenge of how different situation, different people's who like workers or like just only residents, kids can be all using one space that they're getting all benefit from this place, and then we create more like a green buffer for like a challenge of the climate, but also we're thinking this buffer will be more like feel like people feel safety in that areas, and also how we relate to the original issue is by the climate, we thinking like the green should be more like a buffer for like a safety areas. And also we thinking we have the questions for like
Yeah. A few questions that we have about the Atlantic Avenue is that how can the redesign of the avenue effectively address the rezoning challenges from an industrial zone to a mixed-use development while minimizing pedestrian disruption and also balancing commercial sidewalk usage with residential front yards?
Nice one, easy question. Unless either of you wanna go? No, thanks. It's funny, so when I was in graduate school, I actually had to look at this same section because at the time, the Barclay Center was gonna be put there. And I went to Pratt, so it was it's in close, this particular section is close proximity to Pratt. And that was essentially our job. Like think about Atlantic Avenue between Flatbush and going east. Think about exactly as you described, the auto shops, how they're using the street. Think about the change in the character. And it's interesting that so much has changed down by Barclays, but also so much has not changed. I think it's really interesting. I don't know that I actually have any direct answers, but I think that there are some things that I want to throw out for you all to think about. I think it's this one, and definitely I'm more familiar with Jamaica Avenue, less so Jerome Avenue, is let's remember that these are major arterials, and so that means that they connect a very long distance, right? So Jamaica Avenue goes all the way into basically Long Island. It goes into Nassau County, and on the other end it goes all the way into Brooklyn. And think about the change in character and the change in feel, even though it is still primarily a commercial corridor throughout the way. What does that mean? Is there an opportunity to think about it as a continuous connection? Is there a way to think about it as a continuous way to think about how maybe goods could move, almost like a conveyor belt, if you will, right? And I think similarly on Atlantic Avenue, it goes all the way down towards the BQE, and the character of Atlantic Avenue in the Brooklyn Heights-ish area, right by the Columbia waterfront district feels very different. It somehow is quieter, even though the BQE is buzzing above. The width of the sidewalks are different. It feels more small townish, almost like Main Street-ish. Then you get to downtown Brooklyn, right, where the sidewalks are huge, but at the same time, there aren't really that many people on it because it's not an inviting walking experience. Then you get here and it gets a little chop-shoppy, it gets a little industrial, and again, you're not really seeing as many people walking because it's not inviting. And then as you go out to East New York, which also has been rezoned, and if you have been out there at least in the last 2 years or so, DEP did a major street reconstruction out there, and so there's new landscaping, there's new masonry. It literally feels completely different. It actually feels more like a boulevard. So I would encourage you all to think about the fact that these major arterials change character through their ability to connect. And is that an opportunity to create more of a unified way of thinking about how they could be used?
Yeah, I agree with that. This is one of the longer streets in New York City, and it does change dramatically from east to west. If you start in the westernmost, it feels much more pedestrian oriented. The lane allocation is different there, even though I think the right-of-way is essentially the same width. Then it becomes much busier. Just traffic feels more present. But I also think that there's a lot of, the westernmost portion, I think, really shows that there are also a lot of inefficiencies with the way that the easternmost portion of the street is designed. I think, things like double parking become more visual there, and you sort of realize that, okay, a lot of the rightmost travel lanes are actually not really being that used for travel. So that's the continuity or the lack thereof across the corridor is really interesting. And this is one of the critical east-west truck routes across Brooklyn. And so thinking about how to make this a more pleasant pedestrian and cyclist-oriented space alongside truck traffic is a really fundamental question here, especially because a lot of people might need to cross Atlantic Avenue to get to Fulton Street, which is kind of the main commercial corridor that parallels Atlantic Avenue. And one thing that I think is really important when thinking about truck routes is I was surprised to learn that actually most of the arterials that we're talking about are a truck route. They're either a local truck route or a through truck route. And I believe Atlantic Avenue is a through truck route, which means there's going to be more substantial trucks that are traveling on it. So that's something you have to contend with. And of course, so you have a new diagram, the underground infrastructure having to do with the Long Island Railroad. But I was surprised to learn that more than 50% of the parcels along truck routes are actually residential. They're not commercial or industrial, even though we kind of associate truck routes with, I do at least, with those types of land uses. And so, we really do need to do a better job of thinking about how to marry the truck traffic with the people who actually live along these truck routes. And so Atlantic Avenue is really the best, a really prime example to try and figure that out. Especially if you're going to upzone the neighborhood, which the city is.
I want to bring this back to the curb zone, which I think is the opportunity zone in these arterials, and exactly in this sort of tension between through traffic and truck traffic, and more residential development happening along these routes. And I think what the students were describing and where there's maybe an untapped potential is to say, do we really need parking in that zone, or can we use that a lot more to create this buffer between these two different needs? And also, and then here's the other thing, my sort of question to you, or like a way of poking to say, I'm wondering what else could be there. Can we prioritize climate action and sort of see, is it businesses and uses that have a way of either adapting to climate change or mitigating and reducing emissions? And could that be a policy in which, or a guidance, design guidance of how we decide what goes into the zone that's not up for grabs, but we all hope it would be?
Can I actually add on something to this? So I spent a lot of time on curbs in my former role. And one thing I actually want to point out is that for me, once you, if you're talking freight and deliveries, once you start talking about at the curb and what we call essentially the last mile, which is between like the distribution warehouse and its final destination, to me, that's the end actually of the discussion. I actually think that we should be talking about the steps that get us there, right? And so I think, I know your tasks were to talk about the street as is and to imagine, but I would encourage you to take a larger step back and ask the question, well, why are we using trucks so much to get stuff delivered to the curb in the first place, right? Like that is actually the question that needs to be asked. Are we over packaging the products that come to us that are then forcing us to use more trucks to then take up more space at the curb? So what do I mean? My famous example, I'm a makeup girly, I love Sephora, right? And if you've ever ordered from Sephora, whether you order 1 lipstick or 10 lipsticks, it comes in the same size, but I see shaking heads, you understand? The box is the same, it drives me nuts. And so, if you think about it, if my lipstick is this big and the box is this big, how many lipsticks can actually fit on the truck, right? And so then how many truck trips does the truck need to make to get the thing to me or to the store, right? So like, where are the questions around packaging? Where are the questions around, should there be an additional tax for maybe something like an overnight delivery? Where are the questions about, can we start to move goods by water, right? Which I actually have some of these answers, but I'm throwing them out. Right, like can we move goods by water? Can we use drones, right? Can we, what are the things that we can do to encourage people to go pick up their goods? And I think that once you start chipping away at consumer behavior and then public and private sector investment, addressing that in the middle, then you're able to actually ask the question, how do we best use our curb? So I would actually encourage you to think beyond what you're physically seeing and think about the decisions that get us there.
I want to pivot to one more project, which we have here on the screen already, and the idea of prioritizing low carbon transportation. You want to go ahead?
So, hello everyone. Our group worked on 126th Street in Harlem, where we identified several issues such as unsafe intersections, heavy pedestrian and cycle traffic, inaccessibility and inefficient bus routes, and a lack of overall urban diversity, which contributes to urban retardant effect, as well as in making the space uncomfortable for us to walk through. Our redesign prioritizes all the modes of transportation other than the private car, so bus and cycle. Some of the key design changes that we are focusing on are centralizing the bus routes, making fewer car lanes, as well as making a lot of speed reducing design features, like putting a ramp through the car so they are forced to slow down, as well as coloring the bike lane in a different color. And we also introduced a roundabout intersections that give priority to pedestrians and cyclists along with the two-way protected cycle lanes.
Our redesign also tackles the issues of climate risk and an uncomfortable corridor environment. The main way this is designed is through 2 complete rows of street trees that are wide enough to handle the roots, via soil cells, or just enough space in general, and high biodiversity plantings, expanding the urban plant palette to tackle these diverse risks, This tackles urban heat, carbon sequestration, water infiltration, pollution reduction, increased urban biodiversity, and reduced energy consumption, to name some. We would love to open the discussion with you about how we can ensure buses are prioritized in the corridor and how we can shift the mindset from car-centric to cycle and public transport. We're also a bit curious of why hasn't a centralized bus route already been implemented in NYC? It's implemented in other areas around the world. We're wondering what's the difference here. We would love to also discuss expanding the urban plant palette based on from the existing one that already exists in New York City to increase biodiversity and adapt to the new climate change challenges, and why, if that's being done or not already. Thank you.
I guess I'll start with some answers. I don't know enough about the where priority, the analyses that determine where priority bus lanes are located or not. There's one that was just opened on 96th Street, so certainly similar in terms of that east-west connection and connecting then also to north-south subways and certainly on 125th also the Metro North. Just one other thought that was interesting to hear here was the idea of, and Tiffany, you may have some better thoughts on this, but the speed of travel, and my guess or sort of experience is that traffic is very slow on 125th, and so changing the types of vehicles that are there and prioritizing bus, etc., is helpful. But I'm also wondering about some of the kind of density of vertical elements and design from a speed standpoint here, where traffic is pretty slow in comparison to maybe Atlantic, where at least that's my avenue. Where
the speed limit is the same everywhere, right?
Right.
Posted, yes.
But where, to me, having more vertical elements and the rezoning, street trees growing over time, in some sections through our Great Streets program, more sort of historic street lights, and not the Cobra style, where all of those elements serve to reduce traffic speed, where maybe truck traffic feels unsafe, whereas I think certainly some parts of 125th Street traffic actually moves very slowly already because of the volume. And then I'll leave it there so I can.
And I think the question is sort of in general, like, what do you think? Where do you see the roadblocks politically, or just from an operational process standpoint, to as a city agree that we want to prioritize fast buses over fast cars? They're all slow right now anyways. And can we say, well, why don't we give the buses the priority? I think there's overwhelming support for congestion pricing. There's been a lot of applause for eliminating the parking mandate. So there's a lot of anti-car movement in the city. What then are the political or procedural barriers to implementing some of these
I'll
ideas?
just say very, very quickly. Let you all respond. But one of the sort of recent analyses that DOT has done is a pedestrian mobility plan that characterizes streets based on kind of projected, modeled pedestrian volume. And I will say that 125th is the sort of busiest, in that busiest category of a global corridor, that the idea that people are coming from everywhere here, and so this is a street where you would want 25-foot sidewalks or super sidewalks where you're putting down the gravel epoxy layer as the temporary solution. And that gets a little bit to your discussion about the changing character around these arterials that go for 2 miles or 4 miles, and there are sections where there's transit hub and there's schools, and there are the centers of activity that draw pedestrians, and then there are other places where even along the same corridor, not that Jamaica Center, you don't have to go that far in either direction, and you're really downscaled in terms of both the buildings that are there and also the kind of pedestrian density. I don't know necessarily how that plan and how that sort of categorization of pedestrian travel density translates to DOT's own priority framework compared to environmental justice and injury accident statistics, but I think that's an important level of the kind of policy making that's already been done, and also maybe a helpful analytical tool as you think about different sections of the street.
Yeah, so if I can, a couple of things. So again, my background is not engineering, but I'm going to tell you some things that make me a little bit nervous. So the roundabout makes me a little bit nervous just because I see the car about to turn into where the bus is supposed to be going, and that kind of freaks me out, but I get it, we're just doing it for illustrative purposes. There are cities in the world, many of you I'm sure are familiar, where bus rapid transit or something very similar run in the middle of the street. Probably most commonly known is the Transmilenio system, which is in Bogota, Colombia, which has often been looked at as like the gold standard for BRT. One of the things though about BRT, and then I want to come back to your question about why can't we prioritize it, don't let me forget. One of the things that we need to understand about true BRT and what we have in the city of Select Bus Service is that I call Select Bus Service BRT light, right? Or diet, right? Which I won't take credit for those, but they're catchy. And I say that because full BRT has more capital investments in the system. So you'll see that there are more firm concrete pedestrian waiting pads built into those systems in the middle of the street, right? The way that the thing that makes the bus travel faster is that people are purchasing their tickets in advance, and then there's essentially an honor system once you get on the bus, unless there's other enforcement. The concrete pads also need to be able to hold the ticket machines unless we're doing it digitally, right? Like the different type of electricity required for lighting and bus shelters. There's also things like special filters to let the buses get priority down the street. So there's other physical in-street infrastructure that's required to get you closer to true BRT. And also in many instances, you need more roadway width. Right, so on some of these streets, that just doesn't physically exist. And if you've ever walked past an open like Con Ed project, you can have a sense of what underneath looks like, and nobody ever knows where anything is, right? So there's a different environment physically here compared to other parts of the world, and so that's primarily why you have Select Bus Service compared to a true BRT. Now, question about why can't we prioritize those things? In my opinion, there's two things that have nothing to do with design and physics. One is you're applying logic, so shame on you. And two, political will, right? Like these are things that you cannot design your way out of. Technically, a third thing is enforcement, but that's a conversation for a different day. So largely what I'm saying is, does a government administration, does a leader, it's not necessarily a commissioner, it could be a mayor, it could be somebody else, do they have the political will to want to prioritize these types of projects, right? In the same way that they prioritize other things. Do they see the value in fighting for something like this as a public good in the same way that they see other things? And we can see across different administrations that that has not been consistent, right? So I think like as you do your work and you're asking yourself these things, well, this answer seems very clear and very logical. Why are we doing it? It's probably because it has nothing to do with you physically being able to do it. It's just that you're trying to be logical and there's probably a political force that is pushing very hard against it.
And you can see, we weren't looking at Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue where these kinds of transformations are happening right now. We were interested in Northern Manhattan or the outer boroughs where that political will is harder to come by, or the political force that comes out of the stakeholders there maybe is not as strong. I want to open it up to questions, but we're also very close in our timeline to, are there any questions from the audience? Lee.
I'm, yes, very much political will, but there's also I think the physical realities of our streets are below grade. New York City is a developing country. Right, we don't know where anything is. You said that, and I think there is a huge level of complexity that stems from just how many stakeholders, how many city and state agencies and other entities, Con Ed, have a say in implementing these things, right? So it's one thing to develop these really ambitious visions. I'm wondering if you guys could speak a little bit about your experience with, what happens when you try to make something like this happen? What happens when you try to implement a visionary idea? What are the roadblocks, not just in terms of policy, but also in terms of the way the city government operates within the streetscape?
I have stories, but please go first.
You all have the city government experience, but I guess in terms of some of the conversations we've had, one thing that stands out to me is somebody from DEP that we spoke with who sort of said that there's a real hierarchy and a pecking order to what happens in terms of the street down to below ground, and so. By the time an agency like DEP gets a chance to look for places to put green infrastructure, there's really nothing left. And so maybe the hierarchy is right. Maybe it's something that we need to sort of re-examine, and green infrastructure needs to be higher up in that hierarchy. Something like landscape clearance diagrams that we have in New York City are incredibly complicated, and I would love to speak to somebody about each of those feet and inches and why they are what they are. Because it really, especially in places like commercial corridors, it means that that's why I feel like they're so devoid of vegetation and trees, is because there are just too many math equations that have been run that leaves kind of no space for vegetation, at least in terms of the conventional way that we install it. And so maybe revisiting some of those regulations is something that we need to do, but I'll let the people with the government experience
I don't
speak
know.
to
I'm
that.
newer at the city, so.
Okay. So there's a couple of things that I could say to this. One, sometimes it's just timing. You can have a good idea in the wrong administration. Lots of ideas circle back. I've been doing this work, I guess, closer to 15 years now. The amount of times I've touched a project, the same project, from different lenses of employment, you'd be shocked. And then all of a sudden I'm the expert on that project because I've worked on it so many times. So sometimes it's always been a good idea, but nobody's had the political will, right, or the timing or the economy, whatever, to make it go through. Also, I love a pilot. I love a pilot program, right? Like, give me a 6 months, give me a year, because I get to test things. And not that it's, you know, a free-for-all in terms of running a pilot, but there tends to be more flexibility in what you can do, right? And you're telling people out in the outset, hey, we're trying something, and we want to know if it works or it doesn't work, and we will analyze it at the end, and then come back to you and tell you how we were or weren't responsible with your tax dollars, right? And so, like, I think the opportunity to pilot programs is something that you can continue to do. And then I think the third thing is, what ways can you be creative within your own budget? So I'll give two very quick examples. They happen to be transportation related, sorry. So at City DOT, under Jeanette Sadiq Khan, when she was commissioner in the Bloomberg administration, and this probably predates some of the students, but Times Square did not look like it did back then that it does today. That whole pedestrianization of it, all of that was car traffic. She literally wrote a book called Street Fight about the fight to turn that into a more pedestrianized space. And she did it within the confines of her own budget. You heard Zach mention earlier, talking about the epoxy. What he's really talking about is that beige paint looking thing that you see that extends beyond some sidewalks. It's because it means in a couple of years, the actual sidewalk is gonna extend to it. So that's what that is. But it's drawing something with materials that already exist within the agency. Hey, we're about to make a change, right? Like, and so now the idea of pedestrianizing spaces, or even the idea of creating an open street, which literally you're just putting barricades at the end of the street, right? You're not physically changing the street in any way. You're utilizing the resources of the agency that already exists to make change. Another quick example of that is actually out on Long Island, where I'm from, in Suffolk County, the Suffolk County transit system, the public bus. They literally, a year ago, decided to make their service better. And in no comparison, listen, growing up, there wasn't even Sunday service, right? Like that's where they are, meet them where they are. But I mention it because they wanted to improve the service of that network. And they did, and I think they improved ridership by like 30% in 2 months. And all they did was look at their network and figured out that the connections at major destinations, the buses weren't making them on time. So they reallocated some of the routes, they deleted a couple of the routes, and then now the major connections figure like where it really meets Long Island Railroad, the buses make it on time, and they've changed the whole landscape of their operations. And when I asked them, did you purchase additional buses? Will this cost you more money? They said no. They said, we did this all within the actual budget line, and we can do this and sustain that moving forward. So there are ways of actually making change with the resources that you have, and that's like another way, especially if your agency's goals don't align with the current administration leadership.
Yeah, I'm really glad you explained better the idea of the sidewalk, sidewalk extensions, and the sort of paint by numbers, or maybe Harold in the purple crayon kind of, indicating where streets can be different and have different uses. And I think even the extent to which above ground planters have become part of the, part of the toolkit. The New York City DOT has a street design manual. There are certainly maintenance and lifespan issues and water use, etc. But I think there are a lot of ways of these kind of. I think DOT has done a very good job at integrating the tactical urbanism approach, and then the other piece I want to try and connect a couple things. My colleague Alan is here and has really had us thinking about from these from interventions that we would try, from pilots, what's the kind of instrumentation, what's the data gathering, so you're not just kind of socializing an idea by having the pilot, but then also there's some air quality monitoring, there's some temperature sensors, so that if there is an intervention and pedestrian observation, traffic counts, etc., so that you're getting a sense of whether something works or not. That's not to say that all of the political, someone still has to care to look at that data, but I think that there's a lot that we can do to evaluate the efficacy of some of the things that we're doing in terms of these kind of temporary measures, or not full-on capital reconstruction.